Okay, this is my first conference at Clinician, and it's been a very good experience, and I've enjoyed the different varieties of topics and the point of views. And so I'm going to continue that same variety, and I'm going to be talking about value not from a goldfish eye, but from a full-time clinician's perspective. And so my talk, or my title then, is Patient-Centered Measures. And I'll refer to those frequently throughout my presentation as PRO, Patient Report Outcomes, and how patient-centered measures and PRO data assesses value of your services to your patient, as well as understanding performance. Whose performance? Well, the clinics and the clinicians. And so I'm a full-time clinician. And so I'll be sharing with you my many, I like to say years, but it's decades, of experience collecting PRO data during everyday clinical practice to guide my treatment strategies to enhance the value of my patient care. Now, to start, there's two basic central tenets for evidence-based practice for the clinical physical therapist. And the first is to monitor outcomes to judge clinical performance. This is really an effective way to facilitate behavioral practice change to a more evidence-based approach. So for example, you may have a patient who's not doing very well. And I think we learn more from those patients than those who always are doing well, because it gives us an opportunity to look at our clinical treatment processes and maybe consider alternative ways that we could have thought of to facilitate a better outcome for this patient. Now, the second most important tenet, I think, is that the clinician needs to understand the importance of patient feedback. And that's the use of patient-centered data, or PROs, during clinical practice. So this is using data while you're treating the patient, at the patient's bedside, I would call it. And again, to enhance your treatment effectiveness and value of care to your patients. Now, so why use patient-centered measures? Well, I think a good analogy is Weight Watchers. Instead of asking someone, well, how much weight did you use? Insist on using a scale to objectively determine change in weight, because you're more likely to trust that. Well, that's what a patient-centered measure is. It is a scale to objectively determine treatment effectiveness and value of service. And so for my outline today, it's going to be basically two chapters. Well, value, okay, from my perspective, and performance, and how to calculate performance. And then I'm going to finish up today by going over two important tips that clinicians who are using data can return on Monday morning and start implementing these tips in order to start enhancing value and performance. Okay. And FOTO'S system really is well positioned to determine value and performance. Since its inception in 1992, there are now 13 million patient episodes within the National FOTO database. And that's coming from over 4,000 different clinicians in every state in the country, and from at least almost 4,000 clinics and hospital outpatient-based therapy centers, or occupational. And FOTO is now the main management company in US, Canada, and Israel. Okay, so first chapter, value. Value in the perspective of how we can use value and document value to underpin the future of alternative payment strategies. Okay, so it'll be looking at that. And the historical perspective on value started with the Institute of Medicine, or at least they capitalized on it in 2001. And basically what they wanted to do is encourage alignment of financial incentives with best clinical practices and the achievement of better patient outcomes. Then MedPAC, 4 years later, comes along. That's Medical Physician Advisory Committee, says, yeah, hey, let's endorse this vision. You're onto something good, Institute of Medicine. Let's endorse that. But then they threw something into the fire. And they said, well, let's encourage, let's implement alternative payment plans to justify value of service. And there's 4 important caveats here that we need to do. First, yeah, you need outcome measures, but not any outcome measure. You need something that's reliable, valid, and responsive. We'll talk more about that. And the data must be based on clinical evidence. Okay, clinician, it's your time. I want to know, what is the value of your services while you're treating the patient at the bedside? I want to know what's value from the clinician. Data should not be burdensome. And finally, you need to be able to interpret this data using risk-adjusted analyses. Again, this is MedPAC. And these 4 bullets will permeate through the rest of the presentation because they're really important. Now, these data come from the World Health Organization Global Healthcare Expenditure Database. And current healthcare expenditures as a percentage of gross domestic product in the United States for healthcare is 17%, which is a 21% increase since 2001. Well, I wish my stocks would have gone up 21% since that time. They haven't. But it's unsustainable, right? And that's why value is front and center in today's healthcare marketplace. And patient report outcomes, PRO, are going to be very important to determine value or physical therapy services going forward, especially in light of the ever-changing landscape of healthcare and the soaring costs. Now, one reference here, there are many, but the one that I like the most when I read about what is value in healthcare is Porter. Okay, this particular reference came from the New England Journal of Medicine in 2010. He's written many articles about this, books, whatever. But the underlying point here is, how do we define value in rehab? It has a very succinct definition. Value is effectiveness. Okay, well, what is effectiveness? Effectiveness is function. Rehab is function, function is rehab. That was coined by Dr. DeLito from the University of Pittsburgh, I guess 20 years ago, and his vision seems to be ringing true today. So effectiveness or change in the patient's function, but we can't just treat patients forever. We have to do it efficiently. So value must look at 2 important concepts of effectiveness and efficiency. Okay, so value in physical therapy services. Whose value should we measure? How do we choose an accurate measure? And importantly, how do we interpret what we measure? And that's what we're going to answer each one of these questions next. Okay, whose values? Well, different stakeholders have different views on their definition of what value is. You may ask a payer, and they're going to say, well, tongue-in-cheek, well, best value is the fewest number of visits. So 1 visit is best value. Perhaps the employer may say, well, value is an employee forgoes sick time and continues to work full-time, full duty. A clinician may think value is, well, it's an improvement in my range of motion, or it's an improvement in functional muscle strength. Or perhaps the patient's viewing value as the change in his or her quality of life based on that treatment rendered. And whose value is best captured within an operational definition of evidence-based medicine? You've heard of that term. That's been around for a while now. That first came from who? Somebody called Sackett. And this has stood the test of time and has not changed 1 iota. And this is the definition. And that's the integration of best research evidence with your clinical expertise. You have a play in this. With your patient's values to optimize their care, okay, and quality of life. And clinician, you're included in here also to achieve the highest level of excellence in practice. Okay? So Sackett, again, this has not been changed, and I think this definition actually got the government interested. Institute of Medicine, MedPAC, et cetera, followed this lead. And patient's values is front and center. Now, I like this slide because it offers an easy-to-remember definition or view of what evidence-based practice is. So, clinician, I would say, you're sitting in the middle of this triangle, and you're trying to navigate a plan of care. And the patient better be sitting on top of the triangle because they play the central role in the delivery of care. But clinician, you have 2 strengths. You have your expertise. You should have knowledge of the literature. What is the literature saying? For example, lower back pain. What should I do? Integrate those strengths. Apply it to the patient, understanding that patient's values and preferences. And what you have here is the APTA's vision. And it was revised in 2014 because there were 2 essential components missing from the previous vision. And now that's added in the term value and function. Well, value is function achieved efficiently. And that's where we're going. That is the vision. But to ultimately achieve this vision, clinicians need to perform systematic patient feedback through the use of PRO data throughout the clinical episode to actually get to the point of enhancing treatment effectiveness and value. And this may be the operational definition of a clinical expert. Okay. So how do therapists measure treatment value? Well, how many are full-time clinicians in here? Anybody? Yeah? Okay, good. Okay, good. Some people raise their hands. So how do we measure treatment value? It could be change in impairment, changes in signs and symptoms. It could be change in physical performance. It could be just the change in disability role at work. But for the presentation this afternoon, I'm going to limit it to patient-centered measures, PROs, for a very specific reason. This is a gold standard, okay? And we'll look at that momentarily. But again, just to review what a patient report outcome is. It objectively assesses the patient's quality, values, and his or her perceptions regarding experience performing physical activities. And here's the gold standard start. And this was from the Institute of Medicine back in 2001. Here, just in quotes, patient-centered, okay, providing care that is respectful and responsive to individual needs and preferences and values, and ensuring that patients' values guide all clinical decisions. That's a pretty important end of the sentence there. And if you look at it, and if you do take a peek at some of those medical journals, you'll see it is a gold standard. It does provide us with the evidence. Okay? If you go to the literature, it could be level 1, randomized controlled trial, all the way, sophisticated observational research design, all the way down to a case study at level 4. PROs are integral in the methodology in generating the evidence that we triumph as better practice. So that's what PROs are doing in the science. They assess a wide range of patients' physical activities quickly, and as I've said, they are endorsed by policymakers. Could be MedPAC, Institute of Medicine, the World Health Organization, CMS, National Quality Forum, and the list goes on. They are also endorsed by current physical or occupational professional associations, and certainly within the current clinical practice guidelines that we frequently review. And they are underpinning the development of these alternative payment methods. And you've heard of the term pay for performance. Okay? We'll talk about how these types of data can develop or calculate provider performance in the next chapter I'm presenting. And then finally, it may be driving consumer reporting. So if you go on the website now, Save on Medical, what we're seeing is consumers are demanding what? They're demanding best value with lowest costs. That's what the consumer wants. Consumer is going to be driving healthcare, as we heard this morning. So we should be able to market them and show them specifically where that value is within that geographical area. Okay, so yeah, how do we choose what types of values? Yeah, patients' values. Now we're going to go to how do we choose an accurate measure next, okay? Well, it better be supported by the science. The science in the sense that critical psychometric properties need to be published using that measure in the clinic: reliability, validity, and responsiveness. And FOTO has over 90 a little bit plus, published peer-review articles supporting the science of its measures. And you can go on the FOTO website under the Science of FOTO tab and spend a week, maybe 2 of your time, to kind of absorb and sort out all of this information. So there's a lot of research track history supporting science of this particular outcome tool measure. Now, this is fun. I mean, clinicians would often say, you know, well, how accurate a measure is a PRO? Come on. I mean, sometimes my patients say, I'm not sure how to answer this question. Can you help me? Yeah, what does this mean? Well, how reliable and accurate is that? Okay. So what is the clinician's perspective of PRO? What is the science behind PRO? Because they may not be the same. So the clinician may be looking for something, well, we may not value a role of PRO because they're looking for something more black and white. Well, I'm more comfortable. I've had that goniometer, and I can really get my hands on, I can tell what's going on. So the clinician may think, well, this is subjective, and I prefer my clinical measurements. And sometimes they give me a caveat, well, PROs are helpful only if the scores reflect my true patient's progress as determined by me. Well, that's not really the science behind this. And if we are a culture of evidence-based practice, We have to understand science and integrate it with our expertise to make sense out of all of this. So what is the truth? The whole truth and nothing but the truth. Judge Judy, maybe? I don't know. And let's look at this. So what is reliability? What is a good definition of reliability? It's quite simple. The results are the same when repeated under the same conditions. Okay. So when a measure has good reliability, by definition, it is objective. So although PROs may appear subjective, they are indeed objective if the reliability statistics are good. So let's turn just another example here on reliability. There have been many papers, and I'll pick on lumbar examination tests that you love to do, okay, when you're examining your patient. Well, many of these tests may not be objective because the reliability statistics are not very good. So for example, this was by May et al., a systematic review in 2006, just to keep the right perspective. Okay. Now the science behind the photo measures, the retest reliability has been 0.89 to 0.96. And then internal consistency estimates. This is an IRT assumption. I'm not a statistician, so I can't explain it more, but hey, go to the Science of Photo tab to find out. But it was very high. It was 0.92. And the particular paper on this came from Hart et al. In the Journal of Clinical Epidemiology of 2006, which is a well-respected, high-impact statistical journal. So the bottom line, the results suggest that the photo measures are objective because the reliability statistics behind the measures are very good. Okay, next. What is validity? Well, does the measure or the instrument measure what it is intended to measure? And there are many forms of validity. For example, if you're developing a measure, you'd be interested in content and face validity. Structural validity, again, is an IRT assumption. But the most common types of validity you may hear is about construct, discriminative, and predictive validities. And the summary on the photo measures, that the published results suggest that the photo measures are valid and responsive because the statistics for these measures are quite strong. Okay, so that's the science. How else should you choose a measure for clinical practice? And this is not frequently talked enough. It's not published enough. And that is the ease for collecting data. So you want to make sure that when you do a measure, that you have reduced the patient's burden. What is the patient's burden? The time it takes him or her to complete a survey. And you want to reduce the clinician's burden. What is the clinician's burden? I have to score this, then I have to interpret that score, and I have to document it, et cetera. This has to be immediate. It has to be burden-free. Now, there's two types of PROs, and that's traditional versus modern. Traditional could be paper and pencil, or a paper and pencil type delivered using a computer, and versus modern. Now, of those who collect outcomes in here, how many are usually the traditional kind, PROs? Okay, and how many are using more modern CAT-type measures to capture outcomes? Okay, so many more paper and pencil types, okay? Well, just a little background. I used to do paper and pencil surveys, or the traditional, for about 2 decades. But in 2002, I turned to CAT, and the advantages are phenomenal. And just to go over two, they're psychometric, and there are also clinical advantages of using a modern CAT. CAT is a computer adaptive test. It asks very few questions to determine the same level of precision as a longer scale. Okay? So psychometric properties. This is getting sciencey. I'm not a statistician, but it's kind of interesting in that you get enhanced scoring accuracy at around the score estimates at the individual patient level. But interesting, the same CAT measure, the same measure, as you increase your diversity of the patients you're having coming into your clinic, well, maybe you don't need 3 or 4 different measures. If you're using a CAT measure, and Photo continues to seed higher level items and lower level items into that measure to decrease the ceiling effect. Ceiling effect where? Well, if somebody's highly athletic, how do we start differentiating their levels of performance versus somebody who's way down here at wheelchair level? So you want to eliminate what? A floor effect. And you can do that with a CAT. So it's kind of a dynamic process. Okay. And actually what captured my, this didn't capture my eye in 2002, this did. and that was reduced patient burden. And the publications, we've actually timed tens of thousands of patients. How much time, average time, did it take that patient to sit down and complete a CAT measure? 1 to 2 minutes. Compare that to the traditional lower extremity functional scale. 20 items have to be answered in order to produce an accurate score. Well, what are you going to do? It's almost a 2.5-fold increase in time to do a traditional survey. CATs, you got to start thinking that way. The other thing that's important is if we want to teach the clinician to use data, we have to provide it to them immediately. They have to be able to see it and think and use that data, okay? Know how to interpret it usably. So clinically meaningful information to the clinician, especially if you want to start comparing your patient to that clinician's results, et cetera. And we did an internal survey just out of interest of photo users, and what we found is once they started using CAT, the traditional paper and pencil, although important at times, has decreased remarkably over time. So I'd say about 85% of photo users are now using CAT as their first choice. All right, now, choosing an accurate measure, well, I need and I demand, I want to be able to quickly interpret data, and again, in a meaningful way. Okay? I need to have data. And there's data from PRO are considered observational. And so that data needs to have a meaningful interpretation. And physical therapists or occupational therapists need to be aware of important limitations when interpreting PRO or observational data. Okay? Now, your better outcomes, the clinician's thinking, you know, my better outcomes are because I give superior treatment. But there's a humble pie part here. Your superior treatments may be simply due to the differences in the characteristics of the patients you are managing. So this is a quick example. I'll go into a more elaborate example next. So let's say we have, there we go, therapist A treating patient A, therapist B treating patient B. And I'm going to ask you who has the better performance. And this is the results. Both patients, on using their lumbar CAT measure at discharge, improved 15 points. Who has the highest performance? Which clinician had the highest performance? Well, you wouldn't really know that. It seems like 15's the same. But you have to do something. You have to consider the type of patient you're treating. Clinician B is treating an older patient with many, many more medical complexities. So clinician B's outcome shouldn't be that high. So in fact, because of risk adjusting who the type of patient you're treating, clinician B has the better performance for this particular isolated case study. Okay. So the bottom line from that is we've got to compare apples to apples when you're using observational data. And it would be totally unfair to compare comparisons between different patients or other clinicians using raw data. I'm going to go over an example of that. Okay, so risk adjustment, if you've heard of that term, is necessary to level the playing field when you're interpreting data. And the photo system offers sophisticated risk-adjusted modeling to help us to do that. And so just for an example, the risk-adjusted model used by photo is really a sophisticated multivariate linear regression analyses. That's a lot of words. But what it's doing is taking important variables known to influence a patient's outcome, and they put it in this model at intake. The nice thing about a model is it's fluid. You can add different independent variables to see if they remain significant and how much variance they explain in to prove the prediction. Currently, it makes sense, but these are the current variables in the photo model. Patient's age, that seems to be important. Do you want to treat young or older? Who's going to get better outcomes? Duration of their symptoms. Did they have surgery? Who's paying for this? Gender and number of medical comorbidities. In addition, another important variable is the patient's perception of their disability at intake, and then another variable included currently is their fear. Okay? And this is another example of the importance of risk adjustment. Okay? So why do we risk adjust data? And it's, oh yeah, it's an important statistical method, but so what? But it has real consequences for clinicians. And the data I'm about to show you has come from our research group. Okay? So we have 12 people throughout the country who we've gotten together, we've standardized our data, and we're collecting data. And we're going to ask a question: who's the best performer in our group? Now, these are, of course, all encrypted because we don't want to have little wars. But this is the example. So we have 2 well-trained, experienced, credentialed physical therapists within our group. So they have the same manual skill sets, the same approach, their likability is good. Okay, so you would expect that they should have the best outcomes. They should be comparable. But are there factors not related to the clinician's treatment which may influence your outcomes, functional outcomes? Okay. Well, clinician B is pretty frustrated because he figures he should have the same outcomes as clinician A, and clinician A is always better. But clinician B is treating older patients compared to A. Clinician B primarily treats chronic pain compared to clinician A. Clinician B sees a higher prevalence of female within his case mix. Sorry, females, but tend to have worse outcomes than males. It's not me, it's just the science. And payers, clinician B tends to treat Social Security disability, workman's comp, and perhaps auto accident, Medicaid, than compared to clinician A. And clinician B sees more surgical patients than clinician B, higher severity, and more medical complexity. And these are all important non-treatment variables influencing outcomes. So this is what we did. Well, let's take the raw data. Okay, we're not going to risk adjust for the complexity of the patients you're treating. We're just going to look at the raw data. Okay, clinician A is always getting better outcomes. They're getting higher functional change aggregate than clinician B is. So perhaps clinician A is getting 90% improvement. Clinician B is seeing maybe 80% improvement, just guesstimate. So what we're going to do here is now risk adjust and put that data into a risk-adjusted model, and let's see what's happening now. And something changes. Clinician A's actual change is what was predicted based on the complexity of patients clinician A was treating. And yet clinician B's actual improvement was much higher than what was predicted due to the complexity of the patients that person was treating. So we threw the risk adjustment into clinical performance and now redid the ranking, and clinician A is in the middle of the pack. Clinician B is a top performer. It would have been totally unfair to triumph clinician A at the expense of clinician B. It would have been misleading, unfair. And so who needs to know this? Well, payers should know about risk adjustment, perhaps your professional colleagues, if you're still using traditional paper and pencil, or the consumer. We want to allow the consumer to drive the marketplace and allow them to find out who's providing the best value and who's the highest performer. Okay, and risk-adjusted models is the future. Anybody using dial-up phone now? It's gone. Well, I think the day of raw data is also gone. And what you're going to see is you're going to have to risk adjust this observational data if, in fact, a PRO is the central tenet behind driving pay for performance. And so the photo models really at this time are state of the art in the rehab world. Now, if you have, let's say you have 2 people, we're risk adjusting. That would be the first discussion point. Then if you wanted to compare what you're doing to your competitor, okay, well, what variables are in your model? Are you capturing the diversity of the patients you're managing? Okay, so you both sort that out. Yeah, we both do. The next question, well, what's your model's power? How accurate is your model? And then finally, has it been published? If it's been published, you get a little bit of leverage. Now, power is not how much you bench, but power in R-squared prediction is a value. And that's the model's strength or ability at intake to accurately predict what's going to happen by discharge. And there's still, even though you do risk adjustment, there's still humble pie because it is in infancy in its development in the rehab world. But it's still very interesting. I want to go over this. So the R-squared values typically in primary care patients is 25 to 51%. That means the best we can do is predict 50% of the time what may happen to this patient's outcomes. And this was a very interesting systematic review in the European Spine Journal of '07 by Hilfiger. But what's interesting, we take this group of patients, we filter and now look at rehab patients, and the R-squared value is about 35%, which is really not bad for predicting in rehab. I think the gold standard eventually in rehab setting is going to be 50%. And so getting to 50% would be a pretty good model. So it's very difficult to increase your R-squared value or your accuracy of prediction because of the complexity of the patients that we manage. You may have a small clinic and all your patients are the same, or you may work in a hospital base where you're getting all kinds of things coming in the door that you have to treat. So this slide of the elephant, if I have a model square of 35% using this example, then I can identify 35% of the balloons to understand why this elephant is floating. But 65%, I'm not sure. But if you're having raw data, you have absolutely no idea why the elephant's off the ground. So again, it gives you better interpretation of what you're looking at. Okay? And the publications behind this were fairly large. The first one was in 2006. This was a Medicare-funded project. This had over 100,000 patients, risk-adjusted patients, and we're looking at accuracy, all types of impairment. And the R-squared value was 35%. Several years later, Deutscher in 2014 not only did multivariate linear regressions, but he did something called hierarchical linear mixed modeling, et cetera. It sounds sophisticated, and it was. And again, a sample of 20,000 patients, and the R-squared varied between 36 to 39%. So that's the state of the art as it is now. But we're going to continue to seed different variables to see if that power can be raised. Okay, so just in quick review, how do you choose an accurate measure? Well, you want science behind you. You want to make sure it's reduced burden, and you have to be able to interpret that data in a meaningful way, which directly translates into better patient care. Okay, next chapter, provider performance. And before I get into the calculations of how you can market your clinic or clinician's performance, I'm going to do something fun here. All right, so how do therapists typically rate their performance? Let's say, well, this is your wheelhouse. I'm a hand therapist. How do you rate yourself? Or I'm a back therapist. How do you rate yourself? Okay? And so therapists, don't they have a high desire to be successful to help their patients? I think that's why a lot of therapists get into this profession. They want to help their patients. So if I were to ask you, how do most therapists rate themselves? And we're going to do a little survey here. Okay? You can raise your right or left hand. We'll see. But clinicians were asked in this pilot study, there was 250 of them, to rate themselves from an A+ to an F. Okay, don't be shy. How many in here, in their wheelhouse, would rate themselves, their performance, as an A or A+? No one would rate themselves that high. 1, 2, takers, 3, really? 4? Okay, maybe you're shy. How many would rate themselves as maybe B and higher? Okay, there are a lot of hands going up. Well, then how many rate themselves as C or worse? You're below average. No one. Okay, so that's what the study showed, and that's what I see every time I do a survey, regardless of I'm talking to 10 or 200, 300 people. The average, 66% rate themselves pretty high. And almost nobody rates themselves as average or below. Okay? Now, 86% of physical therapists are highly motivated to pursue professional development, aren't they? Certainly are. But what's interesting here is, well, what types of professional development grow that clinician translates into being more effective, not a happy, more effective, producing better outcomes, showing value to increase pay for performance? What translates into that? Well, traditionally, established traditions, I certainly went through this. Everybody wants to go to postgraduate continuing education. Everybody. We all want to learn from clinical mentors, right? And instructors, right? And I guess there's a great emphasis on years of clinical experience. So if you have gray hairs, then you must be the expert, I guess. But not so fast, all right? That's not what the research is suggesting. And if we look at an evidence-based perspective of what professional development is required to translate into what we want to do to market ourselves, to get more money, is value and higher performance. What's needed? Well, after years and years of decades of research, years of your experience, professional certifications have not been consistently associated with better patient outcomes and value. Ouch, right? So what's going on? One caveat to that. Not until last year, Raj Hero et al. In GOSBT of 2014 actually presented some data using the FOTO database that fellows, a very elite group, small group, had better outcomes than non-fellows and residents. But it's a very small microscopic look at this total picture. And what it seems to be important is in professional development, the evidence suggesting for clinicians to learn from their experience, okay, and years of training, they must be provided with optimal patient feedback about what they're doing right or wrong at the patient's bedside. So, what is optimal patient feedback? Well, we certainly want happy customers, and you better have happy customers if you're in practice. But they're not linearly correlated with the underpinning of what value is of the function. Well, what about your impairment measures? Well, my patient improved 25 degrees. I deserve more money. I'm demonstrating value. Or my patient can lift 35 pounds now before they couldn't. I deserve more money because that's value. Or I decreased this patient's pain by 35%. I deserve more money because that's value. But remember what the operational definition of value, what is it? Okay? These concepts, although important, are external markers within our practice. They do not adequately capture the breadth of health concepts associated with the patient's perception of their functional ability, which will drive value and pay for performance. So, what is the optimal patient feedback model? Well, as my topic suggested, it better be patient-centered. It certainly has to be objective and patient-centered. It has to be systematic. You need to collect this data during your treatment fairly frequently. It has to be usable, meaningful, i.e. it has to be risk adjusted. And the FOTO system report, if you get used to this, can give you this information fairly quickly. And I've been using this now for 12, 13 years, and it's been very helpful, but it takes a skill in learning this process. Okay? And it is a skill. And I'm going to show you some data next of how long it takes to understand how I use patient report outcomes to translate into a higher performance level clinician. Okay, so providing clinicians with optimal patient feedback may significantly improve patient outcomes. And this was a very interesting paper, was by Deutscher et al. In Archives of Physical Medicine in 2009. And there's some other psychosocial or psychological journals that these two gentlemen published in. But I'm not going to go into details. All right, so let's calculate provider performance. Well, FOTO has two methods that it's presently looking at. One, you can look at effectiveness, or the current method of effectiveness and efficiency. We can learn from both methods. Now, effectiveness has a formula. What we need to know is a couple bits of information. Okay? We need to know what is, at intake, the prediction for this patient based on their characteristics. How much improvement should they make? Then we need a next information. We need the patient's actual improvement in function by discharge. And then we get this formula. We aggregate scores of actual minus predicted, comes up with residuals. You don't have to remember this, but it identifies or classifies 3 provider performance levels, independent and different from one another by 95% confidence intervals. Okay? So you have high performers, average, and low. And this is what the data looks like. Okay? This particular piece, they all look the same, but we picked on lumbar in this particular sample. And this was done in 2014. And we can see in orange the top performers of all clinicians in the FOTO data. This is thousands, tens of thousands of clinicians, 2011, 12, and 13, and we're calculating their performance. It averaged anywhere from 14 to 20% were the high performers, and 70% were average performers. Well, what does that say about our survey we just conducted? Finding out how good you are may be risky business. Why? Well, when you ask therapists in their wheelhouse how good they are, well, almost 86% are saying, hey, I'm well above average. I'm great. I really help my patients. And nobody's going to rate themselves as average or below. But that's not what the data is suggesting. When you risk adjust that data for the complexity of the patients you're treating, 15 to 20% are high performers, 70% are average performers. Okay? And it takes courage, doesn't it? You don't want to be presented with this information if it's not suggesting that you are the best. But you can learn an awful lot if you start understanding how to improve using this data. And that's what this slide is going to show you. This is remarkable. So we looked at all clinicians, tens of thousands, 2011, 12, 13. And so the number of clinicians keep getting higher and higher each year. So we wanted to filter out something. And we filtered out the same clinicians treating low back pain patients throughout all those 3 years, the same clinicians. And what we found was quite fascinating, is that the low performance decreased by 16%, and the high performance bucket by 2013 increased by almost 59%. So it took 3 years, and this is a skill to develop, and we need to nurture that skill within our clinicians and teach them how to use data, because the reward is fascinating. It tells a story. When you get connected to data telling you a story, then something goes off here. But that was fascinating. Okay. So FOTO'S current method is using risk-adjusted provider utilization. This is risk-adjusted or combined effectiveness with efficiency. So it's basically a national ranking on a linear scale from 0 to 100%. And it's based on a weighted sum compared to all other clinicians in the database or clinics in the database. The application is wide. You can, the owner can look at this. We'll just go to the next slide. I think it's more demonstrated here. So you can look at your scorecard, which you would receive. Now, this is very granular detail. You can make this quite pretty if you're going to market this. But what lights up here is what? The green boxes. Those are your strengths. You've got to market that. And you don't want to kind of be in the red. That's saying, whoa, let's see what we're doing here. And yellow means it's a push. You know, it's a draw. No change from risk adjustment. So if I had a neck problem and I had a hand problem and I'm a consumer, I want to go on the web and find out where I can get best treatment in my geographical area. So if we were to market this, well, this person, this clinician treating neck pain is 49% ranking. Well, maybe you won't choose that person. But this same person is 90% in treating hand. Well, that would probably get my best value at the lowest cost by using that clinician. It's just an example. Okay. Now, important tips using the FOTO system. My time card. What do I have? Okay, good. All right. So important tips that you can start using right away. And these basic tips are kind of what I've already mentioned, but I'll restate again. You have to understand the data. You have to use this data to guide treatment decisions. Okay? What type of data? PRO data. And then you need to perform serial status assessments, or it's a systematic patient feedback is what I talked about. So I want to go over 2 case studies fairly quickly, but 2 case studies which highlight the use of systematic patient feedback, the use of PRO data to make better treatment decisions and become more effective. Okay. So these are real cases. Okay, my area, I love treating low back pain patients. I just picked out 2, just because they were so similar, and this was recently. So both patients, A and B, were complete centralization, okay? So you've heard of this term before, and that's a good sign. And so the treatment strategies at this time, this was a McKenzie taxonomy, but it was mechanical reduction, maintenance of that mechanical problem, then pointing the patient into recovery of function treatment stage, very important stage, and then prevention. Well, this doesn't, if you don't do McKenzie, it doesn't really matter because this crosses all classification paradigms. Reduce the pain, maintain the reduction of pain, point them in function, and let's not it happen again, right? I mean, that's very typical in low back pain treatment. Both patients, okay, first 4 visits are still the same. We started mechanical reduction, extension principles. We wanted to confirm my initial classification diagnosis, and then we wanted to maintain the maintenance of that pain. So by the 4th visit, they did not have pain, and I started the recovery of function treatment stage, and I decided on the 5th visit, I'm going to run a serial lumbar CAT measurement to see how well I'm doing, because I'm getting pretty high on myself. I think, well, this is going to be a slam dunk. Well, let's see. Okay, well, let me introduce you first to the 2 patients. That may be good. So this first patient, 65-year-old, okay, chronic low back pain, great health, maybe takes an Advil once in a while, likes to dance. And her FOTO system report, her intake score, her functional status score is 68 over 100. Just quickly, she perceives her disability as slight. So if we throw her characteristics into the risk-adjusted model, what pops out is a prediction. This patient should improve 3 points over the episode of care and utilize 8 visits. Okay. The next patient is self-employed, 50-year-old with subacute lower back pain. She is also very healthy. Okay. And her perception of her disability is 47 over 100, so she perceives her plight as moderate to severe in her abilities to do physical activity. And her risk-adjusted model is suggesting she has to improve by 18 points over 8 visits. So here we are at the 5th visit, and I'm going to collect outcomes. Remember, up until this point, both patients centralized, have no pain, and they're starting recovery of function, right? And so what happens to the first patient? Okay, she improved up to a 92, 24-point improvement, 8-fold higher than what was predicted. I did it in 5 visits. Her global rating of change is 7. This is what we call in the trench industry as a high five. All right, you really nailed it. You did a really good job. The graphic designer said, nah, we'll use Superman to show that. In any event, she was discharged at the 5th visit. Okay? Now, well, this patient should be the same. All the clinical characteristics and examinations that I've done tell me this patient's going to do just as well. Well, let's turn to the evidence. She only scored a 55, 8-point improvement, well below what was predicted in 5 visits. I didn't expect that. What the heck's going on with this? Oh, the PRO is not really reliable because it didn't show me what I thought should be true. No, you have to learn from this. Okay, and that's where the system report of usable data becomes so important, and that is, look at this information. Now, this is the skill part. It looks like a lot of information, but you can get pretty slick at what you need to know. You need to know what the science is telling you. You need to know what the patient is trying to tell you. Okay, patient-centered feedback, very important. I'm going to go over this quickly due to time, but this is the science. Have you heard of MDC before, minimal detectable change? That means that they scored higher than a measurement error, or is it minimal clinically important difference to the patient? That's the minimal amount of improvement perceived by the patient, and these are not risk-adjusted calculations. Predicted change is. It risk adjusts for the types of patients you're treating. And this is a typical scenario. The predicted change is usually higher than MCID, greater than MDC. Doesn't always happen that way. You have to know the nuances of if the data comes in a different formula, how you manage that. But this is typical, right? Just that's the science of it. But what's really important as a clinician, it has to be usable data. And you want clarification of the patient's perception. I want to know what patient 2 is perceiving as her ability to do various activities. And this is essential information. If you're going to advance your stage of functional treatment stage, if you want to enhance that process now, remember, they have no pain. You have to do something. And the usable data that you want here is something I'll call generic terms, but it's item mapping and functional staging. What this basically tells you, it shows you all of the activities that the patient is reporting on, that they're having difficulty with, despite doing well clinically. And the status report is telling me that she's still having moderate difficulty performing her usual activities. She's having quite a bit of difficulty lifting what she perceives as heavy. So that's starting to give me insights on perhaps what I have to do next. And the functional staging is simply interesting, and it has years and years of research. But what does 55 mean? Can you quickly, clinically interpret that patient's functional status score for someone? What does 55 mean? And again, multiple papers just to tell you what 55 means. And again, that's the statistics. But 55 means moderate difficulty is exactly what the item mapping showed. And if you really are a data geek and you want to get more granular, I'm not going to spend time here, you can find out level of perceived difficulty for every item in the photo item bank on that. And this is one of the publications. But I'm going to quickly go over that. Another bit of information. If you're treating lumbar, you should have a psychosocially informed perspective. And picking what we picked up here is this patient, too, had elevated fear avoidance beliefs that were not changed by my treating the centralization. And centralization and fear characteristics impact outcomes. Okay? And you have to consider both factors when managing certain subgroups of patients to optimize your rehab outcomes. We talked about this in our paper in Archives in 2009. So briefly, you got to know your data, which we did, right? So at intake, both patients were treated the same, highlighted in the green, okay? And they responded quite nicely. But patient 2 didn't achieve the outcomes that I thought. Okay, now I have to decide on an alternative strategy. And for this patient, we augmented treatment with cognitive behavioral strategies. It happens to be called exposure in vivo, but it's a high focus on physical activities. Why not? This patient, should they be afraid of doing those things she told me she's afraid of? And problem solving. Yeah, have them practice. I have a vacuum in the clinic or a mop or whatever. Have them practice what they're afraid of doing. Go home, problem solve, come back and ask me questions. I saw this patient 1 time a week for the next 3 weeks. She came in now at 25. We reached predicted. Her global rating of change was 6/7. This is an external marker of how much that patient improved from the start of your treatment. That was really nice. So this was a delayed high five. But in any event, she was discharged at the 8th visit. So the tip 2 here is that you need serial status surveys, and that's what I tried to highlight by the second patient. So what do you need? What's mandatory number of surveys? Well, you need an intake, you need a discharge, right? But if you wait till discharge to get that information, you can't think, you can't change anything, it's too late. So the question is, what is the optimal number of functional surveys required to enhance value of care to your, how many surveys do you think you're going to have to do, basically? It's been published. Interesting. How many do you think? Besides intake and discharge. I don't know. Is everyone asleep? Wake up. All right. So do I hear one? At least one survey. You are correct. Okay. If I had a book, I'd give it to you, but I don't. But in any event, it is one survey, at least one survey. And this was published again by Deutscher in the Archives of Physical Medicine in 2009. Why do you think that's so? Why is doing additional surveys so important? Because the therapist is starting to learn to use this data to evaluate if the treatment was effective and allows time for change. And that's exactly what patient 2 did. At the 5th visit, I had to change how I wanted to manage this patient if I was going to achieve predicted goals. And it was effective. I'm not saying this is always going to be the case. This is the last tidbit I wanted to go over, is evidence. So combining information from 2 points in time is much more useful in estimating prognosis than just from intake scores. Whether it be mechanical, psychosocial information, don't hang up your hat on that first visit. Just because somebody comes in with magnitude, overt pain behaviors and going all over the place, not necessarily over-predict that you can't help that patient yet. You need 2 points in time. And this is another example. It's just showing you that FOTO gives you a report in a graph form. Now, I call this flatlining. And it doesn't look flat, but it is flat when you understand the science of what you're looking at. And the first 2 data points here actually predicted that she was never going to reach her predicted goals. So the bottom line, I just want to, as something to hang your hat on to teach your clinicians, is that if you cannot be effective, be efficient. We can't help everybody, but you can learn to use the data objectively to make good decisions about being efficient. Because isn't that value? Effectiveness and efficiency? If you know you can't be effective, you can be efficient. But the goal is always effectiveness and efficiency. Okay. And again, a skill in development. Finally, just to summarize, as I have a few minutes left, FOTO has always taken the lead to provide therapists with the necessary tools to integrate evidence into clinical practice. And that's what has drawn me. As a clinical researcher for decades, this drew me in like a magnet. And that's how I look at the data. Become clinical scientists. You have a lot to say. And now you're being asked to demonstrate value at the patient bedside level. And we need to do that. That's how we can rise and stay competitive. So again, just a quick summary then, looking at the FOTO'S measures, they are psychometrically sound. They are certainly objective. They also reduce burden, the CAT, computer adaptive testing. And then the skill comes in is how to interpret that. And if you do, that should really start enhancing your performance and value. And again, this is a skill worth developing. Okay? Linking outcomes to performance and value, I think, is very important. And then finally, this was my long-term mentor and friend. He always used to say to me, "In God we trust, everyone else bring data. What? This is in the 90s. What the heck is he talking about? Well, 25 years later, I truly understand what he was saying. And thank you, and enjoy your night in New Orleans. Oh, okay. We have time? Okay, any questions?
How does a clinician get started in doing the CAT? Different testing?
Well, they're going to have a computer,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
No, seriously, some clinics may or may not have a computer. You have to get savvy for geriatric patients, maybe a pen light or touch screen. Okay, so you have to look at the administration of that CAT. And photo is pretty much all about CATs. Okay. I think there are other people out there that offer CAT, and not that many, but CAT is basically the way to go. You can actually, there's a CAT in public domain on the photo website. You can go there and practice. Okay? If you have questions of where to find it, you can call photo and they can show you that. You'll have to do your own risk adjustment analysis, though, and every clinician can't do that. So you really do need a management, somebody to help you with sophisticated, statistical design on these risk-adjusted models. But if they are going to underpin the concept of value, we know G-codes is a total disaster. It's a process. It's never going to show value between us. But if we can start showing or educating even the policymakers on how we can accurately measure value and teach the clinician how to interpret that, we're well on our way to staying competitive. And this measure is independent of provider type. I would love to have chiropractic get on the same measurement tool and have the external hammer say, this is the way data needs to be collected, and then let's sort out who are standing and who are not standing in such a competitive world of physical therapy.
We have time for one more.
I really like the photo. I'm trying to get that from my clinic. I just have two questions. Does it measure the efficacy of certain interventions, like for instance, joint bone or shoulder for example?
Yes, I'll go to a research paper. Look up Daniel Deutscher in the Archives of Physical Medicine of 2009. So he went down and was more granular and looked at individual treatment interventions and how they were linked to the prediction of outcomes. And he found that for different body parts, other interventions were important. Believe it or not, I think it was ultrasound was useful for a shoulder impairment, but terrible for low back. So, yeah, go ahead.
Second question is, your R-squared, your model, you're saying you have a predictive value of up to 35 to 50% coverage.
Yes.
Isn't that no better than random?
No way. No, 50%? I mean, you have some idea at baseline of the complexity of your patient, and you need to consider those complexities in estimating prognosis. So having 35% improvement in that estimate is powerful. We're never going to get beyond 50%. That's not random. What random is doing an estimate on raw data. You can't do that. You can't say this is the intake score, therefore this is the prognosis. That's guessing.
That's great. Mark, thank you very much for that
Thank
great
you.
presentation. We've enjoyed it immensely.